Hello everybody, today at long last I am driving an Aston Martin V12 Vantage, the 2011 original, a car the likes of which we are very unlikely to ever see again from any sort of manufacturer, I think. The V12 Vantage really is a magnificent thing. I mean, let's face it, you take one of the most beautiful cars ever made and you put into it one of the best sounding engines of all time, and then quite frankly you could still get all of the rest completely wrong and still have a hit on your hands. Now, I have a real fondness for the V8 Vantage on which this is based, and indeed the DB9 too, a car that was one of my big surprise hits of 2019. I have also had the pleasure of driving a DBS, truly a dream car for me and many others I know, and unfortunately I didn't really get the chance to appreciate that car on the kind of roads that it's really built for. Today I'm hoping to be able to enjoy this Aston a little bit more than that. Fortunately, it hasn't actually been too long in the real world since I drove the V8 Vantage, so I'll be drawing comparisons with that and also with my own Ferrari 550. Now, that might seem like a very odd and random comparison to make, but the reason for that is quite simple. If you weren't aware, recently I bought a Ferrari 550, which has been for a long time my dream car. Now, the truth is that although that was a car that I really wanted, it wasn't the only car that I had my eye on, and very high up the list was an Aston Martin V12 Vantage, for some very simple reasons. There are very few cars out there which have this glorious combination of two seats, only two seats, a naturally aspirated V12 and a manual gearbox. The V12 Vantage in many ways would also make a lot more sense than buying an old Ferrari, being a lot cheaper to run, to maintain, and everything else. In fact, I'll tell you the exact V12 Vantage that I was lusting after, because I can't afford it now, so someone else may as well buy it. It was for sale at Millennium Heroes, who are part of the Octane collection. They also have Fast Classics and some other brands as well. And it was in a beautiful shade, I believe a special order, fire red. And it had the carbon bucket seats inside, which for me are a must. These comfort items are okay, but the buckets really will suit the nature of this car and put you in touch with the chassis just a little better. It had red stitching and it was just awesome. In fact, the only part of that car I don't like, and the same goes to this of course, are the wheels. I just don't like the design of the original V12 Vantage wheels, but of course they do come off. In fact, something sort of JayEmm looking actually would suit this car down to the ground. I instead went for the Ferrari. I'm very proud that I did, but today's a real test for me because this is the sort of look what you could have won test. We have in front of us a Ferrari 599, which I haven't yet driven, but will be doing so after this. So if you want to go and see that video, it'll already be out by the time you see this one, and the link's going to be up here somewhere. Initial impressions of the V12 Vantage. Well, there's an awful lot that is, of course, very familiar to anyone that's driven a V8. This kind of sat in the bathtub lying down kind of feeling where you can't see an awful lot out of the car. It's very disconcerting. A world apart from, say, the 550, which you can see very well out of, and is something like sitting in a goldfish bowl. Rear visibility is quite restricted, not very good. Side visibility is okay, but you do feel like you're sat way down in the car. And the front is okay, but you really cannot place the corner of the car. I've got a little camera down there on the edge of the bonnet and I can only just about see the top of it. Usually when I put a camera on the bonnet I can see the entire thing, but here I've only got the vaguest idea that it is there. The big difference, of course, is going to be in the engine department, but we'll get onto that in a little bit because that isn't actually the first thing that you notice. The first thing you notice when you're on the move is how different the suspension is. The last V8 Vantage I drove was actually one of the first, a 4.3, and I've got a real fondness for those because I think they are so well judged. The V12 is obviously a lot firmer damped, and I think it suffers somewhat for it. This is what I'd expect a V12S to be like. The faster you go, the better it gets, and at these speeds it's barely acceptable, but it's nearly on 911 GT3 levels of firmness, and it's not as supple and as beautifully damped as I'd expect from an Aston Martin. Quite why they did that, I don't know. I expect it's an effort to try and keep this 1700 kilos in check and make the car as sporty as they could. It's worth pointing out that unlike the V8, the V12S was actually a direct replacement for this and not a model that was sold alongside. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one thing this car also has that the V8 doesn't is bags and bags of torque. It's got ample grunt from about 2000 RPM, and although there's not really much reason to get it spinning much more beyond about 6, it feels like plenty of a power band to really get a move on. This car is also fitted with carbon ceramic brakes, which I believe were standard on the V12. They are much better than on the Ferrari F12 TDF that I recently drove. That was just very grabby and reminded me a lot of the Audi R8 that I took out last year. These are far more progressive and actually quite nice to use. They do squeal at low speeds and they are very expensive to replace if you ever have to, but as a thing to use, they're actually pretty decent and I have no real complaints about them. They will of course stop the car very effectively. Now when I drove the DBS, one of the big problems that I had was with the gearbox and clutch. I drive an awful lot of cars and I get used to not stalling them, but the DBS I managed to stall twice and it made me feel rather silly. This I haven't done so far, but that's probably because I've been keeping one eye open on it and making sure that I don't. I think a large part of the problem is the fact that the first inch, it feels like, of throttle travel doesn't really do anything. I'm actually sort of stabbing the throttle there quite a bit and nothing is actually happening. It's only once you've really sort of pressed down quite a way that anything happens, and I think that probably would fool a lot of people, especially if you're switching between different cars all the time, because you'd expect something to happen, certainly enough to get you off the line. And that's combined with a reasonably light clutch pedal, which doesn't really seem to have much feedback, and an engine that gives you very little warning that it's about to stall. Even this car's owner says to me that he does actually stall it himself on occasion, so I'm glad that it's not just me. That was one thing that actually put me off the DBS, that I thought really, for that kind of car, it probably is better with an automatic, and the auto is a lot cheaper too, and yet still somehow it is the manual that I would want. And then the later V12 Vantage S came with an option of 2 different gearboxes. You could have the Sport Shift 3, which is the 7-speed automated manual, or you could have the Dogleg 7-speed manual, which was in essence a reverse-engineered version of the single-clutch automated box. The gear lever in this car is an oddity. It feels like a 5-year-old designed it. It's just this big cube feeling thing, and it just doesn't feel right in my hand. There's just something a bit wrong about it. I don't know what Aston's problem is with these things. It's just make it nice and simple and easy. It's not particularly difficult. Everyone else manages to get it right. I mean, they didn't even get it right in the new Vantage AMR, because that thing has possibly the most awful looking manual gear knob that I have seen in any car for a very long time. Looks more 90s Ford than 2020 Aston Martin. The V12 Vantage for a very long time looked like it was going to hold its money quite well, and in fact at certain points in time these early manuals were just as much money, if not slightly more, than the later V12S with the automated box in. However, about 18 months ago they dropped in price quite rapidly, and I'm still not entirely sure why. There was no obvious reason for it. They'd held very well for an awful long time, and they weren't dropping at the same time as anything else. For ages it seemed like about 80 or 90,000 pounds was what it would take to get you into one of these, and now 55 to 60 will get you in an early V12 Vantage. And that's how this car's owner came about, because he originally went looking simply for 25 grand's worth of 4.3. He was out with a friend picking up an M4, saw this, a little bit of maths later, and he is the very proud owner of a V12 Aston Martin. This engine is so flexible, it's absolutely fabulous. The steering doesn't seem to me quite as delicate or as wondrous in the V8. And I think that's a combination of a couple of things. Obviously, you have a significant weight penalty sat there over the front axle. And in order to combat that, Aston have fitted bigger front tyres, a 255 sections on this car, and I think they might have boosted the power steering assistance as well. It still weights up, and it's still by no means bad steering, but it's just not as brilliant as you'd get in the V8. Often I'm not the sort of person that subscribes to people saying, oh, well, the bigger engine car has worse steering, because a lot of times I drive the car and think, no, I disagree. But in this case, I think it's just lost that little bit of delicacy that the V8 has. The trade-off, of course, is that massive firepower. Certainly likes a drink too, this, but then if you're going to buy a V12, I think that's something that you have to be prepared for. The good news is that engine is generally a very, very strong lump. The only advice that people have ever given with it is to keep an eye on the oil very, very regularly. It is a wet sumped system, not dry sumped as you'd find in the Ferrari up front, and therefore you do really need to keep it topped up. In the early days of sort of DB9, there were a lot of problems with the system running a little bit low, and when it got a little bit low, that was the end of it. Fortunately, they did improve things, and by the time this car came around, I think they were quite a bit better. If you're interested in the numbers, this engine puts out about 510 horsepower, 420 pound-foot of torque, and that's pushing a car which is around about 1,700 kilos. And that feels a bit like this. Oh, it builds up speed at a serious pace, this thing. It's a bit manic. I mean, I love the old V8 Vantage. I absolutely do. I had a ball when I drove Steve's 4.3 the other week. But that's a car which makes a lot of noise and doesn't go very fast. This makes a lot of noise and goes. Yeah, sport mode just really seems to ruin the throttle response, honestly. The car certainly isn't bottoming out at any point in time. One of the nice things about the Vantage is that it is a relatively small car with fairly short overhangs. The V12s do have a bit of carbon at the front and at the back. At the rear, not really anything to worry about, but at the front, that little splitter that juts out could be problematic. So overall, what's my thoughts on the V12 Vantage? Well, it is a very flawed car. Shares, of course, many flaws with the V8. Can't see out of it very well. Boot space is okay, but not great, especially if you're used to, say, a sporty BMW, Mercedes, something like that. More akin to perhaps an F-Type. If you had an F-Type coupe, this boot space is probably going to come across as acceptable. The steering isn't quite as good as the V8 Vantage, but there is a lot to love. That engine is one of the all-time greats. It goes well, it sounds utterly sensational, and you certainly cannot deny this unit's effectiveness. But for 50-odd thousand pounds, this is a lot of car. If you can't afford one, don't worry, because as far as I'm concerned, the V8 is just as good. They sound great, they're quick enough, but yeah, it's not a perfect car. It's not a perfect car, but I do still want one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.